Hi everyone. In this lecture we're going to focus on Chapter 10 of our text. In this chapter we focus on visual imagery. So first let's discuss what imagery is. Visual imagery is what we think about when we're mentioning this idea of seeing something in the absence of the actual stimulus. So if you can close your eyes and think about a visual stimulus that you've seen and you can actually kind of see it in your mind, this is that idea of using visual imagery. Now, mental imagery is experiencing a sensory impression in the absence of any sensory input, and this could include things like tastes and smells and tactile experiences as well. Now, how is this ability to use visual imagery helpful to us? Well, really, it provides us a way of thinking that adds another dimension rather than just using purely verbal techniques. Now, there is a debate about imagery. Basically, we think about it as the imageless thought debate. So, some psychologists suggested that we didn't need imagery in order to have thought, and some were on the opposite side of the fence. They suggested that we had to have this ability to use imagery in order to have thought. So, the question here really is thinking possible without the use of images at all? Now, we've developed ways to measure behavior that could be useful to infer some sort of cognitive processes that are associated with imagery. One thing that we can do is paired associative learning. Now we'll take a look at some studies that were really geared toward looking at the use of imagery. The first we'll talk about is this Pavio experiment, and he gave participants paired words, so he used paired associative learning, and basically what he found was that memory for words that evoked some sort of mental image were remembered better than those that didn't. So words that were more concrete, so words like tree or boat, were typically remembered better than more abstract words like love or sadness. So basically things that they could have some sort of mental image for, those words were recalled better. And the explanation that Pavio gave for this was this conceptual peg hypothesis. And according to this hypothesis, a concrete noun like tree or boat creates images that other words can kind of hang on to. So it kind of works as an anchor for the pair. And now we'll look at another experiment. This was done by Shepard and Meltzer in 71. This was done using mental chronometry. So this is basically where people are using this ability of mental imagery to mentally rotate an object. And some of the images, I'll show you a few examples of what they looked like, the images that they give to participants. But the idea is that participants should be able to look at two objects and say basically if one matches the other. But in order to do that, they'll have to mentally rotate one object around to see if it matches the other target object. Here we have a couple of examples of stimuli used in this particular task. And again, the goal would be for a participant to take this object here, for example, and try to rotate it around mentally in such a way that it would be oriented the same as this object here. And then they would have to compare the two to see if this one is indeed the same as this one. And what they found was some evidence of a spatial component to this particular task, meaning that participants seem to be able to perform this task using imagery, but also that it depended on the orientation and the amount of rotation needed in terms of time it took participants to perform this task, meaning that if they had to rotate the first object more or further than perhaps the trial before, that it would take them longer, much like it would in real life if you had to rotate an object further or to a further degree. Then it would take you a little bit longer. Well, they found the same type of thing when people were doing this task mentally. So this gives some sort of evidence that there might be a spatial component to this use of imagery as well. Next, we'll look at a study that's focusing more on this idea of spatial correspondence between imagery and perception. And this particular study used mental scanning, which requires participants to create a mental image in their mind and then scan that image to perform a task. And this study done by Koslin in 73, they gave participants a picture to memorize and had them create a mental image of it. In that image, they would ask participants to move from one part of the picture to another. And what they found was that it took participants longer to move mentally longer distance than it did shorter distances, much like it would in real life. So again, we find a little bit more evidence that, like perception, imagery does have a spatial component or is indeed spatial. And here we look at another Cosslin study. This was done using a picture of an island with 7 locations, and participants were required again to make a mental image of the island and make 21 trips across the island. And again, they found that it took longer to scan between greater distances rather than shorter distances. And again, they took this as more evidence that visual imagery is spatial. And here we take a look at an example of an island map that was used by Cosslin. And here you can see that we have our island and we have 7 locations throughout the island here that are marked. And again, participants would be asked to travel between the 2 distances. And if the participant were asked to travel between here and here, that would take a lot less time than it would to travel from here to here. Okay, and we see that reflected here. So the distance in centimeters, we can see that reaction time increases as the distance increases. So we have reaction time, or just time it takes participants to complete the journey mentally across the map, goes up as a function of distance. But in 73, Pilishin suggests that this idea of imagery being spatial, or just the spatial representation, is just an epiphenomenon, meaning that while how we experience visual imagery might be spatial, how it's actually represented may not actually be spatial. So this idea of epiphenomenon basically means that it accompanies the real mechanism behind what's going on, but it's not actually a part of it. Now, he proposed that imagery is instead propositional, meaning that we can represent it by using abstract symbols, kind of like some sort of a formula. Here in this figure, we see an example of the difference between this idea of a spatial or more depictive representation of something versus what Pilishin was suggesting, which is a more propositional, or basically just using abstract symbols. So we have the spatial depiction on the right-hand side. So we have the cat underneath the table, and we see this visually represented by using realistic pictures. But Pilishin was suggesting that it's more like this. So we have the same idea, but it's represented by using just these abstract symbols here. In 2003, Pilishin tried to give an explanation for Coslin's results. So with the island walk study we saw earlier, for example. So basically, he was just saying that these type of results can be explained by using real-world knowledge unconsciously. And this is called tacit knowledge. So basically, again, the suggestion is that subjects are unconsciously using knowledge that they already have about the world to perform these tasks and make these judgments. And it doesn't mean that the results don't suggest then that imagery has to be spatial or is spatial just because of the results. The results can be explained in this way as well. According to him, he would say things like, when asked to imagine something, people ask themselves what it would look like to see it, and then they simulate as many aspects of this staged event as they can. So basically, again, he's just suggesting that people are using knowledge that they already have to perform these tasks, and that imagery, while it might seem spatial, isn't really spatial. Now, it's something to note that Pilishin was in the kind of the minority. Most people tended to agree more with Cosslin and his interpretation that imagery is more spatial. But Pilishin did raise some ideas that couldn't really be overlooked. So more research was done just to kind of look at his ideas versus this idea of imagery being spatial. And in this particular study, they had participants judge whether arrow points were pointing at dots that were previously seen or not, and they found longer reaction times when there was greater distance between the arrow and the dot. So again, this is more like that idea of as if they were actually mentally traveling across the map kind of thing. Now, participants were not told to use visual imagery. And they really were not given time to memorize as well. So they really weren't given any time to memorize the field of dots or anything like that. So they really couldn't use previous knowledge or this idea of tacit knowledge to perform this particular task. So this is kind of the idea of what participants would be given. So they'd be given the first display, and after a 2-second delay, they would be given the arrow. So again, they really weren't shown the dot display long enough to use any kind of previously acquired knowledge or previously known knowledge. So this was taken as a little bit more evidence that there is definitely a spatial component to imagery rather than this idea that participants are just using previously known knowledge to perform a task. Now here we'll compare imagery and perception. And we know perception is spatial, and again the idea is that imagery is spatial as well. In this particular task, we're going to look at the relationship between viewing distance and ability to perceive details. So here we have a smaller object and a larger object. So the idea is to imagine a small object next to a larger object. Now, as you can imagine, we're quicker to detect details on the larger object rather than the smaller one. And this task was done by Coslin. This is a mental walk task. So in this task, they would have participants or subjects to imagine two animals, one small and one large, and they would have them imagine them being next to one another, and then they would ask questions about the different animals. And what they found was that people would mentally move closer to smaller animals than to larger animals when asked about details about the animals. And again, this is providing more evidence, or is taken as more evidence, that images are. Here's kind of an example of how this study that Coslin did would work. So if you were told to imagine an elephant and a rabbit versus a rabbit and a fly, it might look something like this. Now you can imagine if you are using the mental image A and you're asked, does the bunny have whiskers? You would, if you were really seeing this in real life, you would walk much closer because the rabbit is much smaller. You would walk much closer to see whether or not the rabbit has whiskers than you would to see the elephant's tusks, for example, because they're much more visible because the elephant is larger in your field of vision. That's consistent with perception. We also find data in terms of reaction times that suggest that this is how imagery works as well. Here we'll look at the interactions that we find between imagery and perception, and this particular study was done by Perky in 1910. And what they did was they would have participants sit in front of a projection screen, and they would very dimly project a picture onto the screen. And then they would tell participants to create a mental image for the same item that was being projected on the screen. So here we have a banana, for example, and this participant would be told to create a mental image of a banana and to describe it. And what they found was that participants would describe the object as being the exact same as the picture projected. So basically, they were not really creating a mental image. They were just using what they were perceiving on the screen. So essentially, we have a mistake between an actual picture and a mental image. And we do have some neural correlates that we find in terms of this interaction between imagery and perception. Now, we know that imagery neurons respond to both perceiving and imagining an object. So there's some overlap in brain activation here in our visual cortex. We also have some evidence that neurons are kind of specialized. Now, here we're looking at neuron firing, and we find that we have, this is looking at neurons in a person's medial temporal lobe. And we find that we have a response to perception of a baseball, so actually seeing or perceiving this baseball, but not really firing to perception of a face. So this particular neuron responds to the baseball, but not to the face. Now, this same neuron is firing at a fairly good rate when the person is told to imagine the baseball. But when they're told to imagine the person's face, again, we don't find really any rate of firing. So between perception and imagery, we see a similarity. And also we find some specialization in that we find response to both perception and imagery in terms of baseball here for this neuron, but not the person's face. If we continue to look at imagery and the brain, we do find, again, complete overlap of activation by perception and imagery in the front of the brain. So again, this is a good amount of support for this interaction between imagery and perception, but In this particular study, they found differences near the back of the brain. So keep in mind that while there is a good amount of interaction and overlap with perception and imagery, there is some differences as well. Now, what we can use to see whether or not a certain area is associated with a certain behavior, we can use what's called TMS, or transcranial magnetic stimulation. So basically what this does is decrease brain functioning in a certain area of the brain for a very short period of time. And if we see a behavior being disrupted, then we can kind of draw from this that perhaps the deactivated part of the brain is what is causing the behavior, or at least correlated with that behavior. Now, Koslin in '99 used this technology to basically deactivate the visual area of the brain during perception and imagery tasks. And what they found was that response time was slower for both perception and imagery when this was done. So what we can take from that is that brain activity in the visual area of the brain plays some sort of causal role for both perception and imagery. Now we'll take a look at some neuropsychological cases. So the first thing we can talk about is unilateral neglect. So this is what happens when we have a patient that is ignoring one half of their visual field, both in perception and imagery. So basically they're just seeing half of the visual field, both with perception, real life, and in mental imagery as well. And this, of course, is usually due to some sort of neurological damage. Now, in this particular study, we're looking at a brain-damaged patient, and this particular patient's perceptions were intact, but mental images were impaired. So this particular patient could perceive things in the real world well and normally, but couldn't really use mental imagery. The mental images that they tried to create are impaired. Now here, this kind of gives us some sort of dissociation between imagery and perception. We know there's a good amount of overlap, but we know it's not complete overlap. And this is just one case that gives us some evidence of that it's not complete overlap, because if that were the case, the patient would either have both perceptions and imagery intact, or would have neither intact. But in this case, this patient has perceptions intact, but mental images are impaired. So again, this just kind of telling us that the two, while there is an overlap, the two don't completely overlap. Something is going on in different areas of the brain for each one. Now we'll look at this patient RM. This particular patient had damage to both the occipital and parietal lobes. This patient could draw accurate pictures of objects in front of him, so perception was good. But this patient could not draw accurate pictures of objects from memory using imagery. So imagery is impaired, perception's okay with this patient. Now we look at patient CK. This patient could not name pictures of objects, even in his own drawings in front of him. But he could draw objects in great detail from memory. So imagery is okay, perception not so good. Now we do have, again, evidence for double dissociation between imagery and perception. And again, this is indicating separate mechanisms. But again, we also have evidence of shared mechanisms as well. We do have a good amount of overlap. Now again, we do all agree overall mechanisms are partially overlapping here. We can say that visual perception involves more bottom-up processing, so located at lower and higher visual centers, for example. But imagery, if you think about it, is more of a top-down process, and this is said then to be located at higher visual centers. Now, imagery being top-down, we can think about a lot of our use of imagery. We're using you could argue it's maybe more even of a cognitive process. So we're using our experience, for example, or our expectation to make a visual image. Now, again, that makes a lot more sense that it would be top down versus bottom up. Now, this whole idea of these different centers between perception and imagery, they explain the cases of CK and RM, but not the case of MGS. Now, you want to take a look at MGS in your text more closely. Now we can look at differences in experience. Now, perception is automatic and stable. We know this. Imagery, though, takes effort and is quite fragile. It's not as stable as perception is. And again, imagery takes effort because this is something that we're actually having to create mentally. Now, we're looking at some differences in how we can use perception versus imagery. In this particular study, they had participants create mental images of ambiguous figures. Now, what they find then is that it's difficult to flip from one perception to another while holding on to a mental image. Now, what this tells us then is that perception's a lot more stable, and it can continue as long as you're observing an object, but imagery is fragile and it kind of disappears without continued effort. And that's a difference between perception and imagery. Now, again, just to clarify, would be considered ambiguous because what do we have here? Do we have a duck or do we have a rabbit? So if we have a rabbit, this would be the ears and mouth here, and if we have a duck, this would be the duck's bill. Now, we can focus on ways to improve our memory using visual imagery. Now, this is just some ideas to help you guys out. First would be placing images in locations, and this is called the method of loci. So this would be visualizing items to be remembered in different locations in a mental image or a spatial layout. So you could, for example, use the layout of your apartment or the house you're living in and place visual items into different rooms of the house. So, for example, if you have to go to the grocery store and you want to memorize 5 different items, you could take your items, place them all mentally in different rooms of the house, and that might help you remember them. The last thing we can do is associate images with words. We can also use peg words. So this is basically associating items to be remembered with concrete words. And you can pair each of these things with a peg word. You can also create a vivid image of things to be remembered with the object represented by the word. So again, using visual images of things and kind of tacking items onto more concrete words might be more helpful for you if you're trying to use imagery to improve your memory. So as always, remember to go through this chapter very carefully in your text. Please enjoy your reading, and I'll be back with you with chapter 11 next week. Have a great week, guys.